Adults were buried on their back, often with other people in small graves. What's really interesting about this, however, is that out of the 131 burials found at the site,
women were buried together, and often they were related, sisters. Men were buried together and were brothers, but you were never to see a man and a woman being buried together. Men and women weren't really marrying, they were mating. The men were going out of the village and mating with others. The reason that the men were traveling outside of the village is because we believed that the village was one family unit, and so they couldn't intermarry.
What Professor Gao told us is that this may indicate that this was a matriarchal society in which the women actually had most of the power in the society. The women were the ones who were buried with almost all of the grave goods, including pottery and jewelry, while the men were buried with almost nothing. Interestingly enough, 15 of the burials were also very odd. These burials were face down, with no grave goods, and pointed in a very different direction. Professor Gao doesn't know what this means yet, but they're working to figure out why these 15 people were buried in a very different way. One of the most interesting aspects that we got to see at Banpo was houses built on top of one another. Traditionally, once a house is destroyed, you move on and put a house in a different location. But at Banpo, as we saw, houses were built directly on top of one another. That means that there's something really important to the people of Banpo about staying in the same location. As an archaeologist, this is really amazing because it allows us to see continuity in which people are continuing to stay in the same place generation after generation.
Banpo Neolithic village is thought to date to about 6,800 years ago. And the reason that we know that is based on carbon-14 dating. And carbon-14 dating is using samples of charcoal that we find in things like hearths and fire pits that were used to cook food within these structures.
Throughout the site, both within the houses and outside of the houses, were a number of ceramic vessels. The pottery you can see behind me dates to almost 6,800 years old. It was made by hand and used to store things like water and food. It was also used as burials for children who were placed inside these jars and then buried outside the houses. Many children in Banpo didn't actually live to see adulthood. The average age at death was about 25 to 27 years old. Oftentimes, starvation and disease caused a lot of early infant mortality.
A large moat or canal was dug around the village. It was some sort of protection for the villagers to keep invaders from coming in. It was some 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide. It was pretty amazing to see the construction there.
Outside of the trench were some of the earliest fields in China. The people of Banpo began to grow millet and wheat to support their lifestyle. In addition to hunting and fishing in the local area, they also were raising pigs to supplement their diet. For archaeologists, this is an exciting kind of thing to see because it shows the transition from hunting and gathering lifestyle in which people were living in a small group, traveling frequently, and sedentary life, in which they're starting to raise crops and domesticate livestock. The entire site of Banpo covers 12.4 acres. About 2/3 of this was residential, while the outer third is all agricultural farmlands.
There were over 200 archaeologists working on the site between a period of 3 to 4 years. There were some 50 archaeologists working at the site during one day. Normally in the United States, we're more often doing what we call testing, where we look at a little spot here and a little spot there and don't really get to see the entire extent of a site. So for this amount to be exposed and for people to be able to see it and research it is just amazing.
After seeing the burials, we moved on to the museum that houses all of the artifacts discovered in Banpo. These artifacts include a whole range of activities, from hunting and fishing to agricultural production. They also have a number of replicas of the houses that give you a chance to really see what culture and life was like back then. The materials we saw in the museum include bone, stone, and pottery. All of these were made into tools. Often, all three of these material types were used for similar purposes. All of them, for instance, were used to break up the dirt for agriculture.
Some of the most interesting things that we looked at included bone needles and awls that were used to make forms of clothing.
The bone needles found at Banpo are some of the oldest in the world.